Disclaimer: it's inspired by reality, shaped by imagination.
It was supposed to be another lively morning on The View, but no one expected the debate to erupt the way it did. Julia Roberts, Hollywood's beloved America's sweetheart, sat at the table with her signature calm presence. Opposite her was Sunny Hostin, attorney, journalist, and no stranger to tough policy arguments. The topic? A question that cuts to the heart of millions of American families. Should housing subsidies for seniors be expanded? From the moment Whoopi introduced the issue, tension filled the studio. Sunny leaned in with her lawyerly precision, ready to argue the financial strain on the system. Julia, on the other hand, was determined to shine a light on the human cost, the seniors struggling to keep roofs over their heads after a lifetime of hard work. What began as a civil exchange quickly turned into something unforgettable. Julia's emotional stories clashed with Sunny's sharp counterpoints, sparking gasps and applause from the audience. Viewers at home flooded social media as the clash escalated into one of The View's most gripping showdowns yet. By the end, the stage wasn't just a talk show set. It was an emotional battleground over fairness, dignity, and what society owes its elders.
The energy in the studio shifted as soon as the topic was announced. Whoopi leaned forward with a half smile, trying to keep things light. So, here's the question for today. Should housing subsidies for seniors be expanded? We know it's a heated issue. Sunny, Julia, I have a feeling you two may not see eye to eye. The audience chuckled, sensing the setup. Julia Roberts crossed her legs and sat back gracefully, her easy smile masking the intensity in her eyes. She didn't wait long. I'll just say this. We're talking about people who've worked their entire lives, who've paid taxes, raised families, served their communities. If they're struggling to afford housing in their later years, that's not just their problem. That's our problem. Expanding subsidies isn't generosity, it's dignity. The audience clapped, some even cheering. Sunny, poised with her notes in front of her, tilted her head. I hear you, Julia, but here's the reality. Expanding subsidies means more government spending, and that money doesn't appear out of nowhere. We're already in a deficit. Someone has to pay for it, and usually it's the working-class families who were already stretched thin. Is it fair to ask them to shoulder even more? Julia didn't flinch. She leaned in. You know what's not fair? A 75-year-old woman who has to choose between paying her rent or buying her medication. I've met people in that exact situation. They aren't asking for handouts. They're asking for the security they've earned. The tension thickened. The audience murmured, some nodding toward Julia, others considering Sunny's fiscal point. Joy Behar jumped in, attempting humor. I don't know about you, but I don't want to be 80 years old fighting over a rent-controlled studio apartment in Queens. Can we just fix this before I get there? Laughter broke out, easing the room for a moment. But Sunny wasn't backing down. She tapped her pen on the table and responded sharply. Julia, I respect your heart in this, but public policy can't be run on emotion alone. We have to think about sustainability. Expanding subsidies without a clear funding mechanism could crash the system for future generations. Then what happens to our kids or their kids? Julia's smile tightened. And if we don't act, what happens to the seniors right now? We love to talk about the future, but while we're debating, thousands of elderly people are being evicted. This is real, it's happening today, and the truth is, if society can't take care of its elders, then what kind of society are we? The studio erupted in applause. Whoopi raised her hands, laughing. Okay, clearly we're just getting started. Sunny shook her head slightly, her voice calm but edged. You make it sound like anyone who disagrees with you doesn't care about seniors, which isn't fair. I care. But caring also means making hard choices. If we just throw money at the problem, we're avoiding the structural reforms that could actually fix housing long term. Julia's voice softened, but it carried weight. I'm not saying there aren't bigger reforms needed, but while we figure those out, people are suffering. That's not a problem we can put on hold. And if that requires more subsidies in the short term, then yes, I believe it's worth it. The applause was louder this time. The spark had ignited, and it was clear this wasn't going to be a polite discussion. The table was set for something raw, emotional, and possibly explosive.
The studio lights seemed brighter now, as if reflecting the rising tension at the table. Whoopi leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, giving the floor over to Julia and Sunny. The air was charged, and the audience sensed it. Sunny leaned forward, her tone sharper. Julia, you're painting this as if expanding subsidies is the only solution, but what about encouraging more private sector involvement? Tax incentives for builders to create affordable senior housing or partnerships with nonprofits. We don't always need to look to the government as the answer. Julia arched an eyebrow. Private sector solutions sound great in theory, Sunny, but I've seen what happens when we rely on corporations to prioritize people over profit. It doesn't happen. Seniors don't have the luxury of waiting for developers to feel generous. The audience clapped, some even shouting, "That's right!" Sunny shot a quick look toward them, then back at Julia, unfazed. So your answer is just to keep expanding subsidies indefinitely. What's the end game? At some point, don't we need to think about sustainability? Julia leaned in, her voice firm but measured. The end game is compassion. The end game is making sure that people who built this country aren't left to rot in their golden years. Sustainability matters, yes, but so does survival. And right now, for too many seniors, survival is what's on the line. The crowd erupted in applause again, louder this time, and even Whoopi gave a low whistle. Sunny, visibly pressing her point, countered. But Julia, that's an emotional appeal. Policy can't be dictated by emotions alone. What you're suggesting could bankrupt the system. And then what happens to those same seniors when the safety net collapses entirely? Julia's eyes flashed. And what happens when they collapse first? When someone's thrown out of their home? When someone dies of stress or lack of shelter because we were too busy debating the perfect policy fix? You can call it emotional, but this is life and death for people. The room grew heated. Even Joy looked taken aback by Julia's intensity. She muttered, "This is spicier than my grandmother's lasagna," drawing a ripple of nervous laughter from the audience. But Julia wasn't done. She raised her hand, almost pleading with the viewers at home. I grew up middle class. I saw neighbors who lost everything when retirement savings dried up. I saw my own aunt, a woman who worked 40 years as a nurse, forced into a dingy apartment she could barely afford. You tell me that's sustainable? You tell me that's the America we want? A hush fell over the audience. Then applause surged like a wave. Julia's words landed with weight. Sunny took a breath, visibly choosing her words carefully. Julia, no one is saying those stories don't matter. They do. But we can't ignore the fiscal reality. Expanding subsidies without reform is like putting a Band-Aid on a wound that needs surgery. We need deeper change, not just more spending. Julia shot back quickly. And while we're waiting for the surgeon, the patient bleeds out. That's the problem with your argument, Sunny. It's too theoretical. People don't live in theories. They live in apartments they can't afford, or worse, on the streets. The crowd gasped. Some clapped, others murmured, sensing Julia had drawn blood in the debate. Sunny straightened her shoulders, unwilling to let go. And what about the taxpayers, Julia? The ones struggling to keep their own families afloat? Do we tell them, sorry, you have to pay more taxes because the government didn't plan properly decades ago? That's not compassion either. Julia's tone softened, but it cut deep. You talk about taxpayers as if seniors aren't taxpayers. They paid into this system their entire lives. They contributed. And now we're telling them, sorry, we can't afford to care for you? That's betrayal, and it's shameful. The audience was on their feet now, clapping and cheering, clearly leaning toward Julia's emotional fire. Sunny sat back, folding her arms, her expression tight but composed. Whoopi raised her voice over the noise. All right, let's all breathe. Clearly, this is not just a policy debate, it's hitting a nerve. But that's what we do here. Julia sat back, but her eyes stayed locked on Sunny, her passion still burning. Sunny pursed her lips, clearly preparing her next line of defense. The clash wasn't just heating up, it was on the verge of boiling over. The studio audience had settled into a tense silence, the kind that feels heavy with anticipation. Everyone knew something deeper was coming. Julia shifted forward in her chair, her hands clasped tightly together, her face losing the polished Hollywood ease and revealing something raw. "Sunny," she began, her voice softer now, "let me tell you a story. Last year, I visited a community center in Los Angeles. They were running an emergency housing program for seniors. There was this man, Harold, 81 years old. He had worked his entire life as a school janitor. He raised 3 children, he buried his wife, and he paid his taxes for nearly 60 years. And do you know where I met him?" The audience leaned in. Julia's voice cracked slightly. "I met him sleeping in the center's hallway on a cot. Not because he wanted to be there, but because his landlord raised his rent by $300, and his Social Security check couldn't cover it. He had nowhere else to go. This man spent his whole life working for this country, and at the end, we left him in a cot in a hallway." The audience gasped, then clapped loudly. Julia held up her hand, quieting them. "When I asked him how he felt, he said, 'I feel like I don't matter anymore.' Imagine that. To give your life to your family, to your community, to your country, and end up believing you don't matter." Her voice hardened. "That's why I fight for expanding subsidies, because it's not numbers on a spreadsheet, it's Harold. It's millions like him, people who deserve better." The applause was thunderous. Even Whoopi wiped at her eyes with a tissue. Whoopi murmured, "That's powerful, Julia," her usually steady tone touched by emotion. Sunny, however, wasn't swayed. She leaned in, her voice quiet but edged with conviction. "Julia, that story is heartbreaking, truly, and no one wants Harold or anyone else to feel invisible. But policy can't be built only on individual stories. It has to work for the entire population. For every Harold, there are taxpayers struggling to pay their bills, and if we drain resources recklessly, we'll create more Harolds in the long run." The audience murmured, some nodding, but Julia shook her head firmly. "No, Sunny. That's the trap, saying we have to choose between compassion and responsibility. We can have both. But too often, responsibility becomes an excuse to look away. It becomes a shield to protect ourselves from guilt while people suffer." The tension was palpable. Julia's eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "I don't care if someone calls me naive. I would rather err on the side of compassion than sit here debating until another Harold dies on a cot." The crowd roared, clapping and cheering, many on their feet. Cameras zoomed in on Julia's face, her raw emotion filling the screen. Sunny pressed back, her tone sharper now. "But Julia, it's not about ignoring compassion. It's about ensuring the system doesn't collapse. If subsidies balloon without reform, what happens when inflation spikes? What happens when younger generations can't afford to pay into it anymore? We will have created a short-term fix that guarantees long-term disaster." Julia snapped back, her voice low but cutting. "And what happens when people freeze to death this winter because they can't afford their rent? Is that long-term enough for you?" The audience gasped audibly. Joy held up her hand, saying, "Whoa, okay, this is getting intense." But Julia didn't soften. She leaned in close, her face inches from Sunny's across the table. "We can't keep talking about seniors as a line item. They are people. People who built our schools, cleaned our hospitals, fought in our wars, raised us. And if we don't take care of them, we're saying their lives don't matter. And I will not accept that." The audience erupted in applause, so loud it shook the studio. Even Whoopi looked rattled, shaking her head with a half smile. "I knew this topic was going to be big, but Julia, you just turned it into something else." Sunny sat back, her arms crossed, her expression steely. She wasn't yielding, but it was clear Julia had struck a chord, not just with the audience in the room, but with millions watching at home. The emotional flashpoint had arrived, and there was no turning back. The atmosphere in the studio had reached a fever pitch. Applause still lingered in the air from Julia's fiery words, but as the noise settled, the tension between her and Sunny hung heavy over the table. Sunny leaned forward, her jaw tight, her voice clipped. "Julia, you're presenting this as if I'm against seniors, as if I don't care about their struggles. That's insulting. I care deeply. But caring means making sure the system doesn't implode so future seniors aren't left with nothing. Do you understand that?" Julia snapped back instantly, her hand slamming lightly on the table. "What I understand is that people are suffering now. You can keep talking about the future all you want, but what about the 80-year-old who can't wait 10 years for Congress to fix the system? What about the people choosing between heat and food today?" The audience cheered wildly, some shouting yes and clapping hard. Sunny raised her hand toward the crowd, trying to keep control. "Listen, everyone wants to help seniors, but if we keep funneling money without reform, it will collapse. And then not only will seniors suffer, but so will our children and grandchildren. It's irresponsible not to think ahead." Julia's voice cut in sharply. "Irresponsible? No, Sunny. What's irresponsible is letting elderly people die in silence while we pat ourselves on the back for being fiscally cautious. That's cowardice, not responsibility." The audience gasped audibly. Some applauded, others exchanged uneasy looks. Sunny's composure cracked. Her voice rose, sharper than before. "So now I'm a coward because I care about fiscal responsibility? Julia, that's not only unfair, it's reckless. You're playing to the crowd, tugging at emotions, but this isn't Hollywood, this is policy." Julia leaned in so close it felt like the table was too small to contain them. Her eyes blazed. "This isn't Hollywood, Sunny. This is real life. And the fact that you can sit here and call compassion reckless is exactly why people have lost faith in leaders. They don't want lectures about deficits. They want to know if they'll have a roof over their head tomorrow." The audience exploded into applause, whistles piercing the studio. Joy, wide-eyed, muttered, "Oh boy, here we go," while Whoopi raised her hands in a desperate attempt to calm the storm. Ladies, let's not turn this into WrestleMania." But neither woman heard her. Sunny slammed her notes on the table, startling even the audience. "You think I don't care? My own grandmother lived in public housing. I know what it's like. But I also know that throwing money at the problem without fixing the system is a betrayal to her and everyone like her. You don't fix a broken boat by bailing water forever. You fix the hole." Julia, her voice trembling with passion, shot back. "And while you're patching your hole, the people inside are drowning. Don't you get it? They don't have time to wait for the perfect solution. They need help now." The audience gasped again, half clapping, half shouting in support. The noise grew so intense that the producers could be seen waving their hands just off camera, signaling the hosts to rein it in. Sunny exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "You can't just bulldoze the facts with emotions. Policy doesn't work that way." Julia's final blow landed like a hammer. She looked directly into the camera and said, her voice steady and filled with conviction, "If caring for our elders makes me emotional, then I'll gladly own that. Because the day we stop putting people before policy is the day we lose our humanity." The audience jumped to their feet, giving Julia a roaring standing ovation. The clapping drowned out Sunny's attempts to speak again. She leaned back in her chair, visibly frustrated, her eyes flashing with anger. Whoopi finally cut in over the chaos, her voice firm but amused. All right, we're going to need to cool this down before somebody flips this table." But the damage was done. Julia had seized the emotional high ground, while Sunny bristled in defeat. The breaking point had been reached, and the clash would echo long after the camera stopped rolling.
The studio was still buzzing from the explosive exchange. The standing ovation hadn't fully died down, and Julia sat back in her chair, visibly moved but composed, while Sunny stared straight ahead, her expression a mixture of frustration and exhaustion. Whoopi tried to ease the tension with a light laugh. "Well, if you tuned in for a calm discussion, I'm sorry to disappoint, but you can't say we don't keep it real." The audience chuckled, though the room still felt electric. Joy added dryly, "I think we just witnessed the most passionate debate about seniors since my Uncle Vinny yelled at the Social Security office clerk."
The audience laughed again, but the humor barely masked the weight of what had just happened. The producers quickly cut to commercial, but the moment had already imprinted itself in viewers' minds. Clips began circulating online before the show even ended. Julia leaning forward, her eyes blazing as she said, "The day we stop putting people before policy is the day we lose our humanity." That single line was replayed, memed, and quoted across platforms within hours. By evening, hashtags like #JuliaForSeniors and #Sunny vs. Julia were trending. Some praised Julia's fiery defense of the elderly, calling her a true voice of compassion. Others sided with Sunny, arguing that fiscal reality couldn't be ignored no matter how emotional the appeal. Cable news segments replayed the clash on loop, while editorial blogs dissected every word, every look, every burst of applause. But in living rooms across America, the debate wasn't about politics or numbers. It was about something simpler: dignity. Families sat at dinner tables recalling their own parents or grandparents struggling to afford rent or medication, and Julia's words rang in their ears. Back in the studio, as the show wrapped up, Whoopi delivered the closing line. "At the end of the day, folks, this is what matters: how we treat the people who raised us, who built this country. You may disagree on the how, but I think we all agree that they deserve respect." The audience applauded warmly, though the fire from earlier still lingered in the air. Julia offered a small smile, visibly drained but resolute. Sunny nodded stiffly, clearly standing her ground, but unable to shake the sting of Julia's emotional blow. It wasn't just another episode of The View. It was a cultural flashpoint, a debate that struck a nerve far beyond the studio walls. And whether you agreed with Julia or Sunny, you couldn't deny the power of the moment. If you enjoyed this unforgettable clash, make sure to subscribe for more dramatic celebrity showdowns, emotional debates, and viral talk show moments. Drop a comment below. Should housing subsidies for seniors be expanded, or is reform the better path?